So this is the latest in what could be loosely considered my skull series. It's a series of videos that have sort of evolved over time. I did a smaller skull a while back, which came out quite well, and then I did a series of videos on making moulds of that piece. And if you've been following my Instagram, you'll have seen me posting a number of skulls recently, so I've really sort of got into this, and I wanted to do a full-size skull. So in this video I'll be taking a quick look at the sculpture. I'll then be going through the mould making process. Now I'm using the same mould making process as I have in previous videos on moulding skulls, but I've made some refinements to the process which I think are quite interesting and hopefully will be quite useful to anyone who's making moulds of this type. So over Christmas I took some time to work on this, and my sort of understanding of how to actually sculpt skulls has sort of evolved since I did that initial piece. When I did that one I paid quite a lot of attention to getting the details correct and trying to do something that was sort of anatomically correct rather than stylised. I think, as I said at the time, we see a lot of skulls in sort of popular culture and in design, and I think the idea of what they look like has maybe sort of drifted slightly from what they actually look like. They're actually really interesting. No two skulls are alike, and I've really found, having looked through a lot of reference, that although you have to stick within certain parameters, there's quite a lot of variation between different skulls. So it's very interesting to try and do different types and sort of get different looks to the skulls. So for this one I wanted to use sort of the additional knowledge I'd gained and really pay attention to some of the detail that I'd observed. Now I should say straight away that I didn't actually film myself sculpting this. The reason being is that I'd already posted a video of me sculpting a skull, so I didn't really want to retread the same territory. This one was sculpted in grey monster clay, and I actually sculpted it over an existing sculpture that I decided I wasn't going to bother moulding, which was this guy. Now, as I worked on it, I did encounter a bit of a problem because the original sculpture was actually quite small, and it was just sculpted over, I think, a ball of rolled up paper. So as I kept adding clay to this to get the correct size, the weight of the sculpture kept increasing, and that meant the armature, such as it was, started sort of collapsing inside the sculpture as I went. So I should have really thought that through before I started, but yeah, the weight of this definitely was a factor, and I actually found that the metal bar that was the stem of the armature ended up sort of poking through the top of the skull, just because of the weight of the clay pulling it down. So if you're going to attempt this yourself, then obviously make sure you've got a very strong armature in there, because a full-size skull made out of clay does weigh a fair bit. Now, as I mentioned with this, I was trying to pay attention to some of the detail on the skull, more so than I had in the previous sculpture. And one thing which I missed from the original sculpture was these sections here, which you can see in this real skull here. And these are actually the channels where the ears go, which I somehow just completely missed at the time. Similarly, the back of the skull has a hell of a lot of detail in it, which I hadn't really paid attention to previously. So as you can see, it's almost as if there are many small bones here which are sort of fused together, and I would imagine that's how babies are when they're born. And I've certainly heard that the sections of the skull fuse together as they age, and that's really what it looks like. So I wanted to try and incorporate some of that detail in as well. Similarly, with the underside, you can see sort of where the spine would join the skull as well. So I wanted to include this detail, and so I spent a lot of time going back and forth on this, trying to get it correct. I rotocast this sculpture in resin, and I'm going to go through the mould making process in a second, but I really do like the fact that you can take quite a large heavy item like this original sculpture, and the final result ends up being very light because you have this hollow cast, and so it really weighs about, I think, 300 grams, something like that. So it's really quite cool to have a large item like this and end up with quite a lightweight final piece. It's got quite a nice feel to it. So the mould making process is very similar to the process I used in some of my previous videos. I've got the sculpture on a stand here with some cardboard beneath it to capture the silicone as it drips down, and all I'm doing is pouring layers of silicone over the sculpture and using an airbrush to blow the silicone into the details of the sculpture. If you do want a bit more detail about this process, then please do check out my previous video, moulding and casting skulls. I'll put a link in the description if you do want to have a look. Now, this was complicated slightly by the fact that my armature wasn't particularly secure, and also the fact that the sculpture was quite heavy, so that meant it was quite difficult to actually angle the sculpture to allow the silicone to flow over it. So that was a little bit tricky, so I had to be quite careful with that. Something I couldn't do with this one was turn it upside down, for example, partly due to the weight, but also because it would have simply fallen off the armature. So that was something that made this quite tricky, and something that I could do on the earlier version that I'd done, but that I couldn't do here. So this was just a bit of a painstaking process and a little bit trickier than it needed to be, but that was just due to me not really thinking through what I was doing when I initially started the sculpture. As before, this is just a slow process of constantly reintroducing the silicon as it drips down and trying to get a detail layer over the whole sculpture. Once that initial detail layer was on there and beginning to cure, I can then come in with a thickened layer of silicon, and that's just a regular silicon with what's called a thixotropic agent added to it. And that's just an agent that thickens up silicon and allows you to paste it on so the silicon doesn't drip down. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just building up a thick layer of silicon over the sculpture. Something that I did for the second mould that I made of my previous skull sculpture was to use these things, which is just some cast sections of silicon into bars. And what I'm going to do here is to add these to the back of the sculpture and around the front. This allows some registration points for the silicon, so when I put a fiberglass shell over it, there's some registration points for that to line up in the shell. Having a thick bar on the back of the sculpture is also very handy, so I'm going to have to cut this silicon to actually release the sculpture, and having a thick piece of silicon at the back allows the two halves of the mould to more easily line up. I've actually done something a little bit different with this one as well, which I'll go into when I come to actually do the casting, and that's just another method that I've found to actually try and align the two halves of the mould when I come to put the mould back together. And what I've had to do here is actually use some clamps to hold this in place. The silicon has a natural degree of springiness to it, so in order to stop it slipping off and springing out of shape, I've used these clamps just to sort of push it into shape while the silicon cures. Okay, so the silicon's now cured, and what I've done is to take some cardboard, and what I did was to just draw around the mould with a marker onto the cardboard and then cut that shape out. It's a little bit imprecise, but it's close enough to allow me to just push the silicon into the hole that I've created in the card, and that's good enough to hold it in place. I've then used some aluminium tape around the edges. That's just so I've got something that the fiberglass won't stick to. And as you can see, I've used some pieces of polystyrene here to create some keys on either side of the mould. What I'm now doing is using some polyester resin and some glass fibre to create a hard case around the silicon, and this is just to support the silicon once I've taken the sculpture out. Obviously it's relatively thin, so it will distort if I don't have a hard case to hold it in shape. So it's slowly curing, and as you can see we've got some green areas and some brown areas, and the reason for the colour difference is just because these are different batches of resin which are at different stages of curing. So it's just interesting to see them change colour as they cure. And it's also a handy visual guide so you can see how things are actually setting up. Right, so I've skipped ahead here, and it's really the same process for both sides of the mould. Do the fiberglass jacket on one, flip it over, put some more aluminium tape down, and then do the second half. As you can also see, I've added some bolts here to hold the two sides of the mould together. And what I've done is to pour some rotocasting resin in and then rotate the mould to create a hollow cast inside. Right, so hopefully what you can see is there's a series of holes on the outside of the mould here. And what I've done is to take a thin piece of tube and to push through the silicon on the back of the mould. Now I did this before I cut the mould to release the sculpture, so what I essentially ended up with was a series of holes through the bar on the back of the sculpture. And the idea here is that these holes are going to allow me to realign the sections of the mould once I put it back together. So as I peel this open, you should start seeing some pieces of aluminium rod popping out, and as you can see there's some showing here. What I did was to push these pieces of aluminium rod into the holes, and that allowed me to align the two halves of the mould more precisely. Something I was getting on the smaller of the skulls that I did a while back was that I was getting quite a little bit of a pronounced mould line on the back. Nothing too bad, but enough to cause a bit of annoyance, and it needed a bit of clean up every time I did a cast. So I wanted to try and avoid that and see if there was a way that I could align the two sections of silicon up as much as possible. So I figured if I had these essentially sort of pegs through the two halves of the silicon, that would allow me to align the mould more precisely and also just hold it together a little bit more. And I've actually found this works really, really well. So I'm just trying to get this out of the mould, and I'm trying to do it in a way that doesn't put too much strain on the mould. Eventually these things do give up, and they tend to do it at the points they're most under tension. So if you can slide the cast out as easily as possible, then that's certainly going to prolong the life of your moulds. So there is some flashing on the back of the cast, but as you can see the flashing is actually really, really thin, and I can just scrape it away with a fingernail. There's a little bit of a line there, but that's much better than the parting lines I was getting on my other casts. So I think this is probably the way forward, and I'm going to do this for any sculptures that I do going forward. I think that's about the best mould line that I've got on a sculpture, so I'm quite pleased with the way that's worked out. So I can now put the mould back in the mould jacket, and all I do is to line the two halves up and then push these pieces of aluminium bar back through the holes, and that just lines the two halves of the mould up, ready to use again. Right, so the painting process for this is exactly the same as the previous skulls that I've done, so I won't go over it in too much detail, but essentially I just gave it a wash of burnt umber thinned down with white spirits, or mineral spirits if you're in the US, and I've just used an old toothbrush to brush that into the details of the mould, then wipe off as much of it as I can, and that gives you a nice sort of bone colour. I then came in with an airbrush and just airbrushed in some black detail into the recesses to give it a bit of shading. Right, there we go. I think it looks pretty cool. There's still a few details that I'm actually not that happy with, so I'm probably going to do another skull in the future. As I mentioned, I've really got into skulls, but there's something about them, they just are fun to sculpt, and they're actually really, really useful. You know, they're very versatile, so I could actually use this as a base for a sculpture if I wanted, or if I was doing a costume, I could easily run off some skulls to add to the costume, or use them as shoulder pads or anything like that. So having a skull mould, I think, is a really handy thing to have for a maker, just because you never quite know where you might find a use for one. But anyway, that's it for this one, so I hope that was interesting, just a bit of a short look at this, but that's it for the time being, so thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.